Hello everyone. So this week we're engaging in a conversation about race, a topic that research commonly shows is often quite an uncomfortable one to have, and/or it's a topic talked about with relative superficiality. As such, what we want to do over the course of the next 2 weeks is think about a few guiding thoughts and questions. First, why is it that race is often seen as uncomfortable as a topic of discussion, and why is this such a problem? Second, how do we become more aware of how race and racism are understood by our students? And what is our obligation towards rethinking commonly held assumptions about race? Finally, what does this mean for our role as both teachers of content and as individuals who take up, as a profession, a position through which we are asked to model critical ways of thinking about our relationships with others? So let's begin with the first point, this discomfort around the topic of race itself. In this section of the module, you're asked to listen to a podcast published by the Globe and Mail as part of their 10-part series on race in Canada. In this particular episode, you will see one of the hosts discuss their experiences talking about race on a radio show from Vancouver and the ensuing discomforts that came from having a difficult and sometimes violent conversation. We hear in this podcast about the idea of what's called white fragility, and how, as Robin DiAngelo puts it, those racialized white can often experience a lack of what they identify as racial stamina, and put up resistance by suggesting that they are tired of hearing about race or feel as though it is talked about all too often. Ultimately, as they put it, and I quote, "White fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves." These defensive moves are often quite subtle, but powerful in shutting down conversations that ultimately seek to surface the essential condition that makes racism possible in places such as school, this being the supremacy of whiteness and the prioritizing of racialized white accomplishment and knowledge in schools. To better understand how defensive strategies often shut conversations down, it's worth looking at what these might be. To do so, I'm going to look at two examples of studies done with largely racialized white teacher candidates and their common responses to questions of race. It's worth noting at this point that these conversations of whiteness and the responses of a largely racialized white teaching population are not to suggest that those racialized white are quote-unquote bad, but rather to highlight the common responses often offered to having a conversation about race by those racialized white. It is only in acknowledging this discomfort that we can begin to be more comfortable having a conversation about it.
In a study from 2005, Patrick Solomon, John Portelli, Beverly Jean Daniel, and Arlene Campbell discovered that racialized white teacher candidates offered and employed three different defensive strategies. First, in what they identify as ideological incongruence, participants vocalized support for contesting racist dominance, but many find themselves resisting efforts and actions designed to undo that racist dominance. One such strategy is a claim of what is often called reverse discrimination, in which programs designed to counteract the manifestation of racist dominance is seen as unfairly disadvantaging those racialized white. Second, participants were seen to engage in what they call a negation of white capital. Here, simply put, teacher candidates deny that white privilege and supremacy exist and do so to their advantage. In large part, this is explained through a line of thinking that is contingent on the idea that since everyone is equal in the eyes of the law and in institutional rules, success is gained or lost solely on the basis of personal effort or skill. What we know, however, is that strong politics and ideologies of race impose particular barriers on students and teachers with respect to determining and supporting success. Finally, some participants employ, with great regularity, a language of liberalism and meritocracy, or the idea that, as I just noted, individual effort is all that is needed to succeed. These conclusions are echoed elsewhere as well. In a study by Verna St. Denis and Carol Schick, they note three tendencies on the part of student teachers. 1. That race is not seen as relevant, but culture is. 2. Everyone has the same opportunities and that effort correlates with success. And 3. There's an overwhelming sense of goodness and innocence on the part of their participants. Elsewhere, Francis Henry and Carol Tatter argued that this works because racism works through the very principles of democracy itself. For instance, the democratic ideal that everyone is treated equally and everyone has the same capacity to exert power actually makes it quite difficult to see how it is that this is not often actually the case. The most common example of this is perhaps the language of multiculturalism, which is wholly contingent on the successful denial of critical conversations about how certain groups of people enjoy substantially more privilege than others.
At this point, I imagine that some may be uncomfortable with some of what I've just said, and or some may be resistant to the implication here that what makes race and racism possible in schools is the operation of whiteness and the subtle but pervasive benefits those racialized white inherit from a system and history of racism. Here, I need to offer a point of clarification, as conversations about race and racism are often taken up as personal critiques and threats. Indeed, a common response to implicating whiteness in conversations of race and racism as the cause is either guilt or anger. However, it is absolutely crucial here to see how conversations about race and racism are not about individual people, but rather a system of politics and culture, all of which are a product of history, that serve to normalize particular ways and modes of thinking that benefit those of us who are racialized white. It is for this reason that I ask you to listen to the Balkasoon and Son podcast and witness at what is at work here. While the podcast revolves around the inexcusable response of one particular radio host, he is a reflection and product of a larger pattern of language and presumptions that make what he said justifiable and intelligible. This leads us to a second point that we need to consider in the context of this conversation. Racism cannot just be thought of as an individual event, and instead, we necessarily need to focus on broader systemic ways of thinking and organizing life that, with great subtlety but tremendous capacity to devastate, serve to reproduce circumstances where some groups of people are disadvantaged to the benefit of others.
Here, it might help to begin by taking a moment to articulate a theory of racism. Racism is defined in numerous ways, so for the purposes of simplicity, let's explore one that is purposefully designed with schooling in mind. Here, I turn to Timothy Stanley's theory of racism, which suggests that it involves three parts. First, racism involves a process of racialization, a process through which A. people are divided based on what is often physical or cultural features, B. these divisions are made to appear natural, and C. these groups are presumed to have essential characteristics. In essence, racisms necessarily depend on the establishment of groups that seem naturally distinct and defined by their essential criteria, however much these essential features may not actually be real. Second, racisms work because they take these racialized groups and then enact exclusions. Here, groups of people are excluded from something simply because of their membership in a particular racialized group. Finally, racist exclusions, for them to be racist, necessarily need to entail negative consequences. This last point is key, for as Timothy Stanley notes, some groups have self-excluded for the purposes of ensuring safety and success.
When we consider this theory as it pertains to schools, we begin to see how it is that school context can be quite powerful in enacting exclusions. Everything from textbooks to the configurations of schools themselves can be sites through which people and groups can become excluded. To see what this might look like, let's take a look at a few textbooks, a part of classroom practice that is so powerful that researchers have suggested that the textbook can often become the curriculum itself in the classroom. I start here because these materials can powerfully, but with tremendous subtlety, represent particular groups of people and then implicitly suggest that certain groups and people belong and others do not.
Take, for instance, this particular excerpt from a grade 8 geography book. At first glance, it may appear to be a rather benign introduction to Canadian economic history, and indeed, as with most, if not all pedagogical material, there's nothing explicitly exclusionary in this discussion. However, as alluded to earlier, we need to more critically read the content that we use. Take the first paragraph under a resource-rich economy, and pay close attention to the tense of the language, which here positions Aboriginal peoples as having done particular kinds of things but not necessarily continuing to do so. Here, for example, the words were, used, and provided serve to locate Aboriginal people in the past, with little to no acknowledgement of Aboriginal peoples in the present. Further, the text presents a rather simplistic snapshot of Aboriginal experience and relationship to what we might call economic activity, one that is summarized rather succinctly in one paragraph. The consequence of this is that students might be led to believe that Aboriginal peoples are a people of the past and do not actively participate in economic activity in complex ways to this day. Problematic representations are by no means exclusive to geography textbooks either. Take, for example, this excerpt from a grade 8 mathematics textbook, which uses an introduction to statistics to remind students that an important notion to hold dear is that, quote-unquote, we, as Canadians, enjoy a high quality of life. Pay close attention here to the language provided. In this case, here, the authors of the textbook are asking the student to justify a conclusion that they put forth, and do so with reference to a claim that fails to acknowledge systemic inequalities and substandard conditions of life for many people in Canada. Rather than complicate what students should know about Canada and potentially introduce a critical conversation about how racism makes this conclusion tenuous at best, the authors use a math lesson to have students construct a nice idea that, quote-unquote, we live good lives, and that by extension, others, and see here the chart, perhaps do not. In this case, students learn a very powerful idea. We are understood in relation to a them, who, in some cases, do not experience the same quality of life. Finally, consider the following example from a grade 8 science textbook. In this introduction to cells, students are asked to consider the historical context that might be necessary to more fully understand the topic at hand. As part of this conversation, students are told that, quote-unquote, early scientists sought to understand physiology better by cutting dead organisms open to study them. At the top of the page, we see a 17th century painting of Dutch scientists, all of which are racialized white men. Here, we need to consider the power of implication and how it is that students are likely going to read quote-unquote early scientists and the pioneering work that they did in relation to the types of scientists represented here at the top of the page. The story told here, then, is one in which early scientific work around cell biology is largely indebted to the work of particular kinds of people, even if it isn't left said explicitly. Indeed, what is powerful here is the very fact that no explicit articulation is made, but rather, students are left with the very subtle connection between whiteness and early scientific achievement.
So, what does all of this mean for school practice? Perhaps the Raby article that you're reading this week can help. As you'll see in the Raby article, we can see what was mentioned earlier working in real ways in schools. Many students articulate an understanding of racism that is preoccupied with individualistic conceptions of the idea. As Raby suggests, racism, and I quote, was denied and downplayed, narrowly conceptualized and framed in the context of a white center. This denial of racism is quite powerful, and this works for what appears to be fairly logical reasons, given that racism is positioned frequently as a behavior undertaken by small groups of people who wish to enact violence and exclusions against others. These students are operating under the idea that, as Judith Lichtenberg puts it, racism exists in the head but not necessarily in the world. This is not to suggest that students are wrong or inappropriately discussing the idea of race. What is needed, however, as Raby puts it, we need a clearer and more comprehensive understanding of what racism is to have students more meaningfully engage the notion in their lives. There are a few things to consider over the next 2 weeks as you enter into a dialogue with your peers and your TA about the discomforts and difficulties with confronting race in the experiences and beliefs of your students and in your own lives. First, we need to consider how race is an uncomfortable topic and involves talking about not only who we are as people, but how we are unequally positioned in a world where people are treated differently for historically and politically powerful ways. Second, we need to contemplate what this means for our classroom. While the conversations that you may be having with your students may have little to do with race and racism are still very much at work, shaping how students' bodies are read and treated and how your students will treat and judge others. Our schools are located in contexts that are inescapably shaped by race, and we have a professional and ethical responsibility to see how race and racism shapes our classroom practice. This also requires us to abandon the idea that what matters most are intentions. We may have the best of intentions, and indeed I suspect many of you do. What matters more, however, are consequences. If we teach in a school that is oriented towards inclusion, ethically driven teaching, and critical thinking, all of this needs to be questioned if students are still being excluded and disadvantaged along racial lines. This necessarily requires, then, that we become comfortable with acknowledging that our practices themselves may be exclusionary. Finally, we need to pick at and acknowledge how whiteness powerfully shapes the taken for granted ways of teaching and learning in our schools. It is often presumed that content in schools is neutral, but that neutrality is often contingent on a conflation of whiteness with neutral. Schools are and have long been designed to serve the interests of particular kinds of people through the rendering of particular forms of knowledge as universal. At times, this has been rather explicit, for example, the residential school system, and at other times it has operated and continues to operate with great subtlety. What has been rather constant across time, however, is the centering of whiteness as the theme and defining factor of pedagogy and content. So my task for you is to disrupt this, name it, question it. This is admittedly not very easy, and it will be uncomfortable. That I can guarantee. However, it is ultimately imperative that we do this kind of work with our students if we want to have a truly just pedagogical context.